In 1993, in the quiet town of Oxford, where nothing exciting ever happens, an old woman is found dead in her study. From the outside, the cause of death seems to be natural. However, there is a strange mathematical puzzle near her body. In the following weeks, several other people are mysteriously murdered. Every time the cause of death looks natural, but there is always a mathematical puzzle left behind the scene of crime. The police are forced to take help from an acclaimed mathematician to solve the mystery. It all starts inside Oxford University, where Professor of Mathematics Arthur Seldom is giving a lecture on the book Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. The book was written by an Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein while he was in the middle of World War I. According to Professor Seldom, the writer wanted to analyze if humans can know the truth about anything. In order to find the answer, Wittgenstein used mathematical logic because it is a subject that is free from the biases of human beings. He ultimately came to a conclusion that there is nothing like absolute truth. There is no singular, irrefutable argument which might help answer the questions of mankind. Elsewhere, Martin, a young student from the United States, moves to Oxford University to study mathematics. He is hugely influenced by the highly acclaimed Seldom. Martin plans to stay as a paying guest at the lovely home of an old retired woman, Mrs. Eagleton. As soon as Martin enters her house, he sees a copy of the famous Enigma machine, which was used to decipher German codes during World War II. It is then revealed that Mrs. Eagleton and her husband were friends with the team who built the machine. But more importantly, Mrs. Eagleton is also a close friend of Professor Seldom. Martin makes it quite clear that he is here in Oxford only because he wants Professor Seldom to supervise his thesis. As the two are discussing, the enigmatic professor, Mrs. Eagleton's daughter, Beth, arrives from the market. It becomes quite apparent from their conversation that the mother and daughter do not get on with each other. Later that night, all three of them dine together, but the mood between the mother and daughter does not improve. Beth is a full-time caretaker of her geriatric mother, and she clearly resents the old lady. She feels like her life is stuck because she has to dedicate the entire time to her mother. After another passive-aggressive conversation, Beth heads towards a nearby symphony where she plays the cello. The next day, Martin is shown around the university by a college staff member. The old man asks Martin if he has selected a supervisor for the thesis. Martin replies that he received a fax from the university informing him that Professor Seldom would be filling up that role. However, the staff member reveals that Professor Seldom has retired from his teaching role and only does seminars nowadays. Later that day, a frustrated Martin takes out all his anger while playing squash at a local gymnasium. He has put several marks on the walls so that he can predict the trajectory of the ball. A beautiful nurse named Lorna, who is also present in the gymnasium, sees this and approaches Martin. She sarcastically points out that his mathematical way of playing only works when he's playing alone. So Martin invites her to join him for a game of squash, and the two of them end up playing together. It is also clear that there is an obvious chemistry between the two of them. A few hours later, Lorna drops him off at home, and both of them agree to have another match soon. Beth is watching the whole scene from the window and starts to get jealous. She immediately confronts him at the door and points out that it cannot be mere coincidence that he chose this house to stay in. She accuses him of strategically using her mother to gain access to Seldom. Martin completely refutes this argument, but does agree that nothing happens by coincidence. Beth then asks him how he remains so happy and jovial with everyone around him. In response, Martin says that he simply goes with the flow. He has a simple philosophy in life. He would rather do something and make mistakes rather than wasting his life by doing nothing at all. He casually suggests to Beth that she too will be happy if she follows his mantra. It does not take long for Beth to reconcile with Martin as she later interrupts him in the shower. She shows him a newspaper announcement which reveals that Seldom is giving a lecture soon. This could be Martin's chance to make a mark or even meet his idol. After a few days, Professor Seldom is once again lecturing a new group of students about the absence of absolute truth. But this time around, there is one student who disagrees with his conclusions, and that happens to be Martin. The young man raises his hand at the end of the lecture and puts forward his critiques. Martin says that everything in nature, down to the shape of a snowflake, is based on a mathematical structure. If humans can decode the secret behind numbers, then they can decode the secret behind reality. Unfortunately for him, Professor Seldom has heard this line of argument several times during his career. He proceeds to completely trash Martin's point, which says that there is mathematical logic behind everything in the human world. Professor Seldom gives several examples of natural phenomenons, like the existence of cancerous cells that do not operate within any mathematical logic. He then concludes that humans are afraid that some things exist beyond their small frame of understanding. Following the lecture, Martin feels extremely humiliated and angrily gathers his books from his study. There, he also meets his research partner, another overseas student named Yuri. Martin is about to leave, but he stops when Yuri asks if he is quitting because the professor has a different viewpoint. Rather interestingly, Yuri appears to loathe Seldom with an intensity for some unexplained reason. Shortly afterwards, Martin returns home and packs his bags because he plans to return back to the US. By sheer coincidence, he meets Seldom on the doorstep. The duo engage in a bit of conversation, and the professor explains that he is there to visit his old friend, Mrs. Eagleton. They both apologize for their respective behaviors during the lecture and enter the house. To their utter horror, they discover Mrs. Eagleton's lifeless body on the sofa. It appears that she was playing a game of Scrabble when she died. When the police get wind of this incident, they take both the professor and Martin for questioning. Martin reveals everything truthfully and points out that he and the professor discovered the body at the same time by pure coincidence. Martin also clarifies that he had met the professor only once before, and that was during the lecture earlier that day. On the other hand, Seldom drops a surprising bomb on the investigating officer. He explains that he was at the house because the murderer told him to go there. The old man claims to have received a note during the conference, which read, "The first of the series," followed by Mrs. Eagleton's address and the time of the murder. It is revealed that Seldom has published several books where he compares logical theories with serial murders. Because of this, he regularly receives a lot of unhinged letters and barely pays attention to such things. That is exactly why he threw the note in a trash can in the street while he was headed towards Mrs. Eagleton's house. The investigating officer immediately sends his deputy detective to retrieve the note. Seldom then tells the officer that there was a perfectly hand-drawn circle beneath the text. He thinks it is a symbol, the first element of a logical sequence. However, even after the interview, the investigating officer struggles to see a connection between the murder and the circle symbol. Seldom explains that in the real world, there are no murders that are committed purely for intellectual reasons. According to him, every serial killer in existence has an emotional, monotonous reason instead of a purely intellectual one. He thinks that whoever murdered Mrs. Eagleton wants to prove that this hypothesis is completely wrong. By doing so, the criminal will have proved that he is more intelligent than Professor Seldom. The circle is a perfect symbol to start a logical series, meaning that this is only the beginning of a sequence of murders. After a while, the professor tells Martin that Mrs. Eagleton had cancer, which could have ended her life at any moment. Martin speculates that this may be the reason why the murderer chose her. The criminal is trying to demonstrate that he is committing the crime purely for intellectual reasons. His aim is to inflict as little harm as possible, which is why he chose someone that could have died at any moment. He could have found out about Mrs. Eagleton's illness from her hospital records, and that made her the perfect victim. The only mistake the killer made was that he accidentally broke the old woman's nose. Professor Seldom finds this theory plausible and asks Martin what he thinks the killer will do next. The young man replies that maybe he will try to be more careful so that he can commit another murder, an imperceptible one. While they are having this conversation, the professor sees that two police officers are headed towards the local orchestra to break the news to Beth. He intercepts them and insists that he will be the one to share this news with Mrs. Eagleton's daughter. Seldom then goes into the orchestra, while Martin quietly rushes to the balcony to observe what happens next. He sees the professor whispering this bad news to Beth, but there is something else that catches his attention. A member of the same orchestra begins to cough violently and looks very ill. That night, Martin is quietly examining the photos from the scene of the crime in his room when Beth arrives. She tells him that she was interrogated for 2 hours and feels that she is the chief suspect in her own mother's murder. Martin sympathizes with her because she has spent so much of her life caring for the old lady. Upon hearing this, Beth reveals that she is almost relieved that her mother is dead now. For the past 5 years, her life has revolved around her mother, and she feels incredibly stuck. He tries to comfort Beth, but she takes this opportunity to make romantic advances towards him. When Martin rejects it, Beth gets embarrassed and runs to the next room. The following day, Yuri congratulates Martin for getting his name in the paper alongside Seldom. He also points out that Professor Seldom has always been very spookily lucky with such events. It is revealed that Seldom and Mrs. Eagleton were the only survivors of a car crash that killed both of their families. Following this, Martin goes to meet Seldom in a local pub. The two once again have a heated conversation about the existence of absolute truth, but this time their conversation is centered around the murder of Mrs. Eagleton and not simply philosophical discussion. Seldom says that they can never be 100% sure who committed the murder because they will never have all the possible irrefutable evidence. But Martin retorts that the police are doing their job and whoever they will catch can be proved to be the murderer beyond reasonable doubt. The professor loses his temper and reveals that the deputy detective was unable to find the note that the murderer had given prior to the crime. This means that if the killer decides not to commit any other murder, Beth will be declared as the culprit because the circumstances surrounding the murder point towards her. The police may not have the absolute truth, but it will not matter in the end. This revelation hits Martin hard, and he goes to the squash gymnasium to blow off some steam. He is joined there by Lorna, who tells him not to be so hard on himself. But Martin is bothered by something else. He reveals that he is actually enjoying this whole fiasco because this murder has allowed him to spend a lot of time with his idol, Professor Seldom. He feels horrible because he is having a jolly good time despite the circumstances. Lorna points out there is nothing wrong about admitting one's genuine feelings. Two of them hit it off and eventually they end up making out at Lorna's house. However, while they are getting frisky, Martin sees the professor's book by the bedside. He asks Lorna about it, and she says that there was a time when she and the professor used to talk daily. She reveals this started when she met Seldom at the hospital. Apparently, he regularly visits the hospital to check up on a terminally ill patient. Martin, however, gets a little jealous and cannot help but think that there is some history between the girl he's sleeping with and his idol. The very next day, Martin follows Seldom to the hospital while the latter is there for the daily visit. Martin quietly sits in the waiting room and accidentally meets Frank, who bombards him with all kinds of crazy talk. Thankfully, Lorna arrives to tell Frank that he can go in to see his daughter. She then explains to Martin that Frank's daughter needs a transplant, and the only two compatible donors refused the surgery. Frank has previously tried to end his own life so that he can donate his lungs belongs to his daughter. This is why all the stress has made him go crazy. Nonetheless, Martin heads to a separate room where Seldom introduces him to the terminally ill patient who he visits regularly. It turns out that the patient, Coleman, was once a brilliant student who later started teaching at Oxford. Professor Seldom urged him to study logical theories, and from there on, Coleman dedicated his entire life studying human intelligence. He designed tests to figure out a pattern behind smartness. Coleman used to grade the answer sheets by himself, and during that process, he came to a surprising conclusion. Most of his pupils had some mistakes in the test, which is normal for average human beings. A small percentage had perfect answers that matched the traditional high IQ bracket. However, it was the third group that gave absurd but completely valid answers. Coleman could not understand the logic behind the thinking of the people in the third group. The intelligence of these pupils was infinitely complex and far-reaching. This realization prompted him to go to a hospital and administer the same test to lobotomized patients with mental illness. Their answers matched with the results from the students from the third group. Coleman tried his best to understand how this group was coming to their conclusions, but he soon realized that his own mental capacity was limited, which made him look at the solutions as an outsider. To understand the symbols, he needed to look at them from the inside and be as radical as the students in the third group. The only way to achieve this was to perform surgery on his own brain. Although this process sounded extremely harsh, Coleman didn't mind it because he was suffering from terminal bone cancer. He had lost his limbs one by one and thus wasn't afraid to go to any extent for his studies. So one day, Coleman took a nail gun and made a puncture in his skull, just enough to render his entire body useless except his brain. From that day onwards, Coleman has been bedridden and writes codes all day long using a mechanical support for his left arm. His codes contain only 4 letters over and over again, which describe a woman's name. That evening, when Martin is starting in the library, when Beth angrily approaches him, she has got the wind that he is having some kind of a romantic relationship with Lorna, so she accuses him of humiliating her and leading her with false hope of love. Martin tries to dispel all the misunderstandings, but Beth causes a scene in the library. She then storms out, and he chases after her only to bump into Yuri. He sarcastically asks Martin if he has found the killer yet. A frustrated Martin then decides to leave the issue and heads back to the library. But on the door, he sees a strange note with coded symbols. Underneath are the words 1415 St. Joseph's Hospital, which means that the next murder is going to happen there. He immediately calls Lorna and tells her to check on Coleman. Martin is almost certain that he has been murdered at 1415. She rushes to check, but everything is normal, leaving Martin confused about the next victim. The scene shifts to a little while later, where Chief Detective Peterson, Seldom, and Martin are examining a dead body in a morgue. It is revealed that the orchestra member who had been coughing continuously for the past few weeks was the murder victim. Peterson points out that his death would appear natural if they hadn't noticed a mark from an intravenous injection. According to the man's medical reports, he wasn't receiving that kind of treatment. This means that he was deliberately poisoned, and the whole pattern is exactly similar to the first murder. They had already concluded that the murderer is trying to prove Professor Seldom wrong, so the culprit followed Seldom to the hospital that he regularly visits and carried out a murder which could easily be mistaken as a natural death. Following this, the 3 men hold a meeting in the professor's office. The murderer has left behind clues in the form of symbols. All these symbols belong to a mathematical sequence, and they can stop the murderer if they can decipher what the next symbol will be. The professor does have a vague idea what the next symbol will be, but he is unwilling to be 100% sure. Peterson summarizes by saying that there is going to be another murder because they can't solve this puzzle. That evening, Martin is headed towards a restaurant when he accidentally bumps into Seldom. It turns out that both of them have been separately invited by Lorna for the same dinner. Turns out she has had a prior relationship with Seldom, and the two were physically intimate. Martin is aghast by this revelation, but she brushes it off because they have more pressing matter at the moment. Lorna tells them that there was no traditional toxin in the victim's blood. The poison that was used was so niche that only experienced healthcare workers could have known about it. Seldom cheekily points out that this new information puts Lorna as one of the chief suspects of the murders. The professor also boasts about his physical relationship with Lorna, which irritates her. She eventually storms out of the dinner, leaving the two men alone. This is when the professor reveals to Martin that he knows what the third symbol is. He even writes it on a folded napkin and hands it to Martin. The old man gives him the option of looking at it now or working it out for himself and proving that he is not an idiot. A few days later, Martin goes to watch Beth practicing in the orchestra. She tells him that her last concert will be on Guy Fawkes Night, which he promises to attend. She leans in for a kiss, but once again, Martin curbs her. A jealous Beth then reveals that Peterson had questioned her about Martin a few days ago. During this interrogation, she may have exaggerated a few details which may incriminate Martin in the murders. He goes to see Lorna and shares his worries that he is now the chief suspect. It turns into an argument, as Martin is jealous that he may be sharing Lorna with Seldom. Fed up of everything, Martin goes to have a drink with Yuri. Unfortunately for him, Yuri is also upset about an upcoming mathematical convention. A presentation is being held to showcase the solution of a complex theorem that is now being solved by a mathematician from Cambridge University. Apparently, Yuri was the one who came with the solution several years ago, but when he shared it with Seldom, the latter shot it down. This explains why Yuri has always held a resentment towards the professor. Martin takes his deranged research partner back to their dorm room, but there he finds a picture of Yuri with Seldom. Neatly tucked in the photo frame is an invitation card for the Guy Fawkes party. 2 nights later, Martin goes to the party and meets Seldom there. The professor reveals that he has been closely followed by Scott, the deputy detective, for 2 days now. As the performance begins, Martin sees Yuri sneaking backstage with something hidden under his cape. He is worried that his research partner has gone mad and wants to take revenge on the professor, so he alerts the chief inspector, who is also there in the audience. They quickly catch Yuri, but discover he was simply holding a protest banner against the professor. Peterson realizes that this incident has diverted all the police officers in the area away from Seldom, who is now sitting unguarded in the audience. At the end of the performance, another member of the orchestra starts to cough and eventually collapses to his death. In the car ride home, the inspector reveals that the third symbol, a triangle, was discovered on the conductor's stand near the victim. The inspector demands that Seldom tell him everything he knows, but the professor indicates that perhaps now is not the best time. Martin takes the hint and gets out of the car so that the two men can have a chat in private. The next day, on the way to the mathematical presentation, Seldom apologizes to Martin and tells him that he doesn't want him to stop thinking about the puzzle. He tells him that the fourth symbol is going to be revealed in the papers, and hopefully the murderer will think that Seldom recognizes his intelligence and stop his killing spree. That afternoon, while Martin is with Lorna, he starts to figure out the next symbol in the sequence. They rush to the nearest bookstore and find a book on Pythagorean symbols that contains the first 3 symbols. This helps Martin to deduce that the fourth symbol will be a tetractys, which is a triangular figure consisting of 10 points arranged in 4 rows. Lorna also knows that some of the medics from that era considered intelligence to be the highest human attribute, so they considered the mentally challenged people as sinners and used them as guinea pigs for their experiments like organ transplant. Upon hearing this, Martin remembers the crazy man, Frank from the hospital, who is also holding a book about Pythagorean medics. It is now clear to them that the murderer is none other than Frank. He is looking for an excuse to murder the mentally challenged patients from the hospital so that he can use their lungs for his daughter's transplant. The duo immediately head to the police station, but do not get the opportunity to reveal their finding. Scott tells them that the murderer contacted the police earlier that day. The killer has instructed them to send ambulances to a particular point on the highway because he's going to target a bus. Scott also reveals that Peterson is already on his way to intercept the bus before it reaches that particular point. Shortly afterwards, Peterson manages to get to the bus that is carrying Professor Seldom and 9 other mathematicians headed towards the university. Peterson calls back to the police station and relays this information to Scott and the others. When Martin hears this, he tells Scott that they have got the wrong bus. The killer was never targeting the mathematicians, or Seldom for that matter. It is Frank who drives the bus for the mental institute that is behind all these murders. Martin immediately calls the professor and urges him to get to Peterson to stop the other bus. Unfortunately, it is too late, as Seldom watches the other bus drive past but is unable to get to Peterson in time. Moments later, the other bus crashes by the roadside and bursts into flames. Soon afterwards, Martin and Lorna arrive at the crash site, where the chief detective reveals that 5 of the victims were possible donors. The driver, Frank, meant to jump out before the crash, but he miscalculated and perished in the fire. They conclude that Frank always wanted to murder the mentally ill children so that he could get their lungs. He carried out all the other murders so that he could shift the blame to a serial killer on the loose. Once the mystery has been settled, Martin decides to return to America along with Lorna. The duo plan to start their new life in the States, but just as they are about to board the plane, Martin finds a napkin in his passport. This is the same napkin that Seldom had given him during the dinner and supposedly contained the 3rd symbol from the murderer. However, when Martin checks it, he finds that the napkin is completely empty. This sends him into a spiral as he finally realizes that the professor never actually knew about the 3rd symbol himself. Martin unpacks the crime photographs from his luggage and notices a curious detail. Mrs. Eagleton was murdered while she was playing Scrabble. One of the photographs shows that she had arranged the word circle in German on her Scrabble board. Following this, Martin goes to meet Seldom in a nearby museum. He confronts the professor with the truth that there was no serial killer. As it turns out, this whole thing was Seldom's invention to disguise the only real crime, the death of Mrs. Eagleton. Beth murdered her mother and then asked Seldom for his help. The professor agreed to help her because several years ago he was driving the car that got into an accident and killed Beth's father, along with his own wife. He had been carrying that guilt ever since and wanted to repay Beth by saving her life. On the day of the murder, Seldom accidentally met Martin outside the Eagleton household. He had come to remove all the evidence of the murder, but now had to go with the flow. So both of them entered the house, and when Seldom saw the German word for circle on the Scrabble tiles, he concocted a plan on the spot. He needed a second death to convince the police that the killer wasn't Beth. In a stroke of coincidence, several deaths kept on happening in the following months. Seldom presented these deaths as the work of the serial killer by leaving the Pythagorean symbols himself. Unfortunately, Frank read about these murders in the newspaper and realized that it was a solution to his problem as well. Every day he drove those kids with healthy lungs but damaged minds and wondered why they should get to live when his daughter suffers. Martin accuses Seldom of provoking the deaths of those innocent children. Once he has spoken his mind, Martin tries to walk away from the museum in disgust, but Seldom stops him and says that Martin was also responsible for this fiasco. He points out that it was Martin who urged Beth to do something and make mistakes rather than wasting her life by doing nothing at all. Those exact words encourage Beth to get rid of her mother and take control of her life. Ultimately, this ironically proves Martin's hypothesis right. Everything in this world has a pattern. Martin's words were like the mathematical logic behind the seemingly random deaths of so many people.
Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.